Beginnings often arrive wrapped in uncertainty. The promise of freedom can feel thrilling, yet fragile, as reality tests every hope and every dream. Benjamin, Thomas, and Katherine discovered this truth the moment they stepped off the plane in Honolulu. Chapter 9. A Fragile Beginning in Hawaii. The tropical sun beat down on the narrow streets of Honolulu as they carried their few belongings through the city. The air was thick, sweet with salt and flowers, and the distant hum of waves rolled in from the ocean. The apartment they rented was small, modest, yet it carried the promise of a fresh start. It was a space far removed from the pressure and manipulation of Florida, far from the shadows of Charles Donovan. Still, freedom came with weight. The apartment was sparsely furnished, with creaky floors and peeling paint, a tiny kitchen that barely fit 3 people, and a living space so cramped that the boundaries between them felt almost intimate. Thomas surveyed the room, noting the imperfections, and felt a familiar tension coil in his chest. Every decision now carried responsibility. Every action could affect the fragile balance they were attempting to create. Benjamin moved slowly through the apartment, his eyes wide, taking in the new environment. Despite his excitement at escaping Florida, he felt a subtle unease. Everything was unfamiliar: the sounds, the smells, even the way the sunlight fell through the windows. He carried the weight of wanting to contribute, to help Thomas, to prove that he was more than just someone being protected. The need to support, to be useful, pressed on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Thomas watched Benjamin with quiet concern. He understood the pressure his partner felt, the desire to help and the fear of inadequacy. Thomas knew that Benjamin's gentle heart would drive him to overextend, to sacrifice for the sake of others, and he felt both gratitude and anxiety. He had chosen this path with Benjamin and Katherine, but the responsibility of ensuring their safety, their well-being, and their stability now rested heavily on his shoulders. Katherine moved through the apartment methodically, assigning spaces, unpacking essentials, and establishing a semblance of order. She had always been the planner, the organizer, the quiet force that kept them grounded. Yet even she felt the strain of starting over in a foreign place, the subtle pang of uncertainty that comes with living far from home, far from everything familiar. Her thoughts drifted briefly to Vietnam, to the homeland she had left behind, and a quiet longing stirred within her. The idea of returning home, of finding a place where roots ran deep, whispered to her as a potential path toward stability and security. Days passed slowly. Benjamin began searching for work, exploring the city, submitting applications, and trying to make sense of the competitive job market. Every rejection was a small blow, every delay a reminder that freedom did not instantly equate to security. He felt the tension in his chest, the pressure to contribute, the constant questioning of his own capabilities. Yet he pressed on, determined to prove his value, determined to carve a role for himself in this new life. Thomas navigated his own challenges. He balanced the tasks of arranging the apartment, managing their finances, and ensuring that Benjamin and Katherine felt safe and supported. The weight of responsibility was heavy, yet he bore it with quiet strength. Each decision felt critical, every choice potentially shaping the fragile beginning they had established. He found solace only in moments of shared laughter with Benjamin and Katherine, fleeting glimpses of normalcy that reminded him why they had left Florida. Katherine's thoughts often wandered to the possibility of returning to Vietnam. She considered the advantages: familiar surroundings, cultural comfort, support networks, and a chance to build a life unthreatened by external power. She hesitated, however, uncertain whether Benjamin and Thomas were ready for another transition, yet the idea lingered persistently. The thought of a homeland, a place untangled from past manipulations, offered a sense of potential escape and security. Despite the challenges, there were moments of quiet connection. The 3 shared early breakfasts, walked along nearby beaches, and occasionally ventured into the city to explore local markets. These excursions, though simple, reinforced their bonds, reminded them of the joy of choosing their path, and provided fleeting relief from the ever-present stress of survival. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. The pressure of finances, the need for employment, and the uncertainty of the future created a subtle, persistent anxiety. Benjamin often reflected on the contrast between Florida and Hawaii. In Florida, he had been constrained, pressured, manipulated. Here, he felt the thrill of autonomy, yet autonomy brought responsibility, and responsibility brought its own weight. He wrestled internally with guilt, ambition, and care for Thomas and Katherine. He wanted to be helpful, to alleviate stress, to contribute meaningfully, yet he also feared failure feared letting down the people who had placed their trust in him. Thomas observed these internal struggles with a mix of tenderness and worry. He knew Benjamin's heart was pure, full of intentions and care, yet naive to the challenges of a new life. Thomas's own internal conflict mirrored Benjamin's, a desire to shield, to guide, to protect, coupled with the reality that mistakes and setbacks were inevitable. The tension created a constant undercurrent, subtle but persistent, shaping the rhythm of their days. Katherine's reflections added another layer. She had moved from assistant to protector, from observer to guardian. Here in Hawaii, her role was multifaceted: supporter, planner, and occasional motivator. Yet her own longing for Vietnam remained, a gentle reminder that freedom could be fragile, and that even the most hopeful beginnings carried the seed of uncertainty. Financial strain was the most immediate challenge. Rent, groceries, and living expenses created constant pressure. Benjamin's attempts to find work were met with delays, rejections, and obstacles he had not anticipated. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he returned home with a mixture of hope and disappointment. Thomas offered quiet reassurances, but he too felt the strain, the creeping tension of potential failure, and the responsibility to maintain their fragile balance. Still, despite the weight of reality, moments of connection sustained them. A shared meal, a sunset viewed from their tiny balcony, laughter over a minor mishap, or the simple presence of one another reinforced their bonds. Each small joy acted as a counterbalance to the pressures and fears that loomed, a reminder that this new life, though challenging, was also theirs to shape. And always, in the quiet moments, Katherine's thoughts returned to Vietnam. The possibility of returning home whispered softly, offering a glimmer of hope and a pathway toward stability. She imagined a life free from constant uncertainty, where work, family, and security could coexist. The idea remained tentative, unspoken, but it grew stronger with each passing day, a quiet anchor in the midst of their fragile beginning. As weeks passed, the trio adjusted to the rhythm of their new lives. They learned to navigate the city, manage their tiny apartment, and share responsibilities. Stress remained, but it became a shared burden rather than an isolating one. Each of them contributed in their way: Benjamin through effort and hope, Thomas through guidance and protection, Katherine through planning and care. Together, they forged a fragile but growing sense of home. Yet the subtle longing for more, security, freedom, and true stability, remained. Hawaii was a refuge, but not a permanent solution. The challenges of employment, the limits of financial resources, and the shadows of past entanglements reminded them that escape was only the first step. The idea of Vietnam lingered, quiet but insistent, offering the promise of a place where they could rebuild fully, without lingering threats. The chapter closed with a delicate balance, moments of warmth, shared purpose, and tentative hope, tempered by the awareness that fragility accompanied freedom. The ocean outside glimmered in the twilight, a symbol of possibility and uncertainty. Within the small apartment, three people navigated the delicate beginnings of a life they had chosen, aware that their next steps would shape the future more than any past could dictate. Chapter 10. The New Boss, David D. Nakamura. Sometimes freedom feels fragile. Just when Benjamin thought Hawaii would be a sanctuary, a new figure emerged, a powerful, unsettling presence with invisible strings connected to the past. The Hawaiian sun filtered softly through the blinds of the tiny apartment as Benjamin scrolled through job postings, eyes bright with hope. Each listing represented a chance to contribute, a chance to support Thomas and Katherine, and a chance to prove to himself that he was capable in this new life. He paused at one particular listing, the company name unfamiliar, but the description oddly enticing. The posting radiated professionalism. Benefits were generous, the office environment modern and sleek, and the description emphasized innovation, mentorship, and leadership. Benjamin felt a spark of excitement and possibility. The timing seemed perfect. Without hesitation, he submitted his application, imagining the potential role he could play, the satisfaction of contributing to their fragile stability. Meanwhile, Thomas observed quietly, a shadow of unease clouding his thoughts. He recognized the company name in a flash, a sudden awareness triggered by an association he had once encountered. David D. Nakamura. The name belonged to a man who had moved in circles with Charles Donovan, the same influential, controlling presence they had fled. Thomas's heart sank slightly as he recalled subtle connections, vague recollections from stories and glimpses of prior social events. He did not know precisely what David might intend, but instinct and experience urged caution. Katherine, ever vigilant, noticed Thomas's tension. She knew him well enough to read his unease without words. Their shared glance communicated silently. This was no ordinary opportunity, and the air was thick with potential complications. Yet she remained outwardly calm, choosing to observe before acting, trusting in the awareness they had cultivated through shared experiences. Benjamin's excitement was palpable. He imagined his first day, the new environment, the chance to prove himself, and the possibility of stability it could bring. He sent a quick note to Thomas, sharing his enthusiasm and a photograph of the office building. His heart swelled with the hope of inclusion, of contribution, of creating a meaningful role for himself. Thomas studied the image, the crisp lines of glass and steel, the sense of structure and control. And then he recognized the man behind the opportunity. David Nakamura. He recalled brief mentions, fleeting interactions, and the subtle influence wielded by David in past social circles. Connections to Charles Donovan triggered a warning deep within him, a quiet but insistent alarm. This was no ordinary boss, no ordinary job. The threads of the past were stretching forward, seeking to entangle Benjamin in ways they could not yet see. The morning of Benjamin's first day arrived with the usual Hawaiian warmth, sunlight bouncing off the nearby buildings and sparkling across the ocean. Benjamin dressed carefully, eager to make a positive impression. The excitement of new beginnings filled him with energy, even as Thomas's unease lingered silently in his mind. Katherine offered quiet encouragement, knowing that Benjamin's optimism was both his strength and vulnerability. As Benjamin entered the office, he was greeted by David Nakamura himself. The man's presence was immediate and commanding. Every movement, every glance carried authority, wealth, and a subtle undercurrent of expectation. Benjamin felt a mix of awe and slight intimidation. Yet he reminded himself to focus on the opportunity, to see this as a step forward, a way to contribute, a chance to help the group move towards stability. The day unfolded with a mixture of mundane tasks and subtle pressures. Benjamin immersed himself in his work, eager to impress, unaware of the underlying tensions shaping the environment around him. He shared photographs and brief updates with Thomas, smiling at the sense of accomplishment he felt. Each moment of productivity seemed to affirm his choice, but the shadows lingered just beyond the surface. Thomas watched the images closely, recognizing David in the frame and recalling his prior associations with Charles. The unease deepened as he considered the implications. David's reputation, his wealth, his subtle influence within circles of power, all suggested potential complications. Thomas's protective instincts flared. He felt the urgent need to caution Benjamin without causing undue fear, to provide guidance without overshadowing Benjamin's excitement. Katherine noticed Thomas's concern and mirrored his attentiveness. She understood the delicate balance required. Benjamin's enthusiasm had to be supported, yet the risks of entanglement with someone connected to Charles Donovan were significant. They both knew the potential for interference, manipulation, or disruption. The stakes were high, and the fragile new life in Hawaii depended on careful navigation. Despite the unease, Benjamin remained unaware of the full depth of the situation. His focus was on learning, contributing, and building a foothold in this new chapter. Every task completed, every acknowledgement received, bolstered his confidence. Yet beneath the surface, the subtle dynamics of influence and control began to shift. The presence of David Nakamura carried weight beyond professional guidance, an invisible pressure echoing the manipulations they had left behind in Florida. Thomas felt the tension tighten like a cord around his chest. Every interaction, every meeting, every glance from David seemed calculated, precise, yet ambiguous. The knowledge of prior connections, the history with Charles, suggested that Benjamin's role in this environment could be vulnerable. Thomas's mind raced, anticipating scenarios, calculating risks, and considering ways to mitigate potential threats. Katherine, ever perceptive, moved through the apartment that evening with quiet vigilance. She reviewed emails, noted subtle cues from Benjamin's descriptions of the office, and mentally cataloged details about David Nakamura. Her instincts told her that the new employment, though seemingly benign, was layered with risk. She balanced the need to support Benjamin's excitement with the responsibility to protect him from unseen influences. Benjamin returned that evening, still glowing from the novelty of the first day, unaware of the growing tension in Thomas and Katherine. He spoke of his tasks, his accomplishments, and the professionalism of the office. His optimism was contagious, yet the underlying currents of concern were palpable to those who understood the broader context. In the quiet moments after dinner, Thomas shared his observations with Katherine, outlining his concerns about David Nakamura's connections and potential motives. The conversation was measured, strategic, acknowledging Benjamin's excitement while considering necessary precautions. Katherine agreed, reinforcing the need for vigilance and subtle guidance. Together, they formed a quiet strategy to navigate the coming days. Benjamin, meanwhile, continued to experience the allure of possibility. He felt a sense of belonging, of contributing meaningfully, and of moving closer to stability. Yet Thomas and Katherine's caution cast a shadow, a reminder that even in freedom, challenges persisted. The juxtaposition of excitement and tension, possibility and caution, defined the early days of Benjamin's employment. As the week unfolded, the trio adjusted to the rhythm of this new challenge. Benjamin grew more competent, more confident, yet the subtle pressures remained. Thomas monitored interactions, advised tactfully, and maintained a protective presence. Katherine supported and observed, balancing encouragement with caution. The fragile equilibrium of their Hawaiian life depended on this delicate interplay of vigilance and optimism. And all the while, the past lingered in the background, unseen but potent. David Nakamura's presence was a reminder that escape from Florida's shadows was incomplete, that freedom was not guaranteed, and that the choices they made now would shape the safety and happiness of their fragile new beginning. The chapter closed with a quiet tension, the promise of growth shadowed by potential threat. Benjamin's optimism, Thomas's caution, and Katherine's vigilance combined to create a fragile, delicate balance. The ocean shimmered beyond the apartment, vast and unpredictable, a reflection of the possibilities and challenges that lay ahead. Chapter 11: 1 Month of Harassment. Even in paradise, shadows can follow. Benjamin soon learned that freedom had limits, and the past could reach across oceans with quiet, relentless pressure. The first signs were subtle. David Nakamura, their new employer, maintained a smile that seemed friendly, yet beneath it lingered something controlling. At first, Benjamin dismissed the minor unease, attributing it to the novelty of a new workplace and the power dynamics inherent in professional life. He wanted to trust, to see the opportunity as a path toward stability and contribution. Yet as days passed, small incidents accumulated. David's attentions became increasingly personal, probing in ways that made Benjamin uncomfortable. Compliments shifted from professional encouragement to observations about appearance and demeanor. Requests for one-on-one meetings became frequent and lingering. Benjamin felt the first prickling of anxiety, the subtle tightening of a knot in his chest that warned him of imbalance. Despite discomfort, Benjamin tried to maintain composure. He reminded himself of the stakes, a steady income, a chance to help Thomas and Katherine, and the promise of building a future they all could share. He felt torn between self-preservation and responsibility. The stress began to weigh on him, a quiet, persistent pressure that gnawed at his focus and energy. Thomas observed the changes from a distance. He noticed Benjamin's occasional withdrawn expression, the brief hesitations before replying to emails, and the subtle changes in posture. He sensed the shift immediately, recognizing patterns he had seen before in manipulative environments. The awareness filled him with urgency. Thomas's protective instincts flared. He felt both frustration and helplessness at the subtle entanglement Benjamin was experiencing. Katherine, too, noticed the pattern. She cataloged the incidents in her mind, each one adding to a growing understanding. This was no ordinary work environment. She traced the connections, recalling David's ties to Charles Donovan, and the realization settled heavily upon her. They were still within the sphere of influence of a man they had tried to escape. Even in Hawaii, the reach of Charles's power was felt in subtle manipulations. The harassment escalated gradually, but unmistakably. Initially, Benjamin endured minor invasions of privacy, vague comments, and indirect pressures. Each incident was small enough to dismiss individually, but together they formed a persistent undercurrent of control. Benjamin's initial optimism gave way to fatigue and self-doubt. He questioned his judgment, wondering if he had misinterpreted David's actions or if his sensitivity was a flaw. Thomas and Katherine became increasingly insistent that they needed to intervene, yet they also understood the complexity of the situation. David was wealthy, influential, and connected. Confrontation could escalate consequences, yet silence allowed the harassment to continue. They carefully monitored Benjamin's well-being, offering support through subtle guidance and protective measures. Every decision felt weighted with responsibility and risk. Benjamin's inner thoughts became a battleground. On one hand, he wanted to persevere, to maintain his sense of purpose, and to contribute to their fragile life. On the other, he felt frustration, fear, and growing anxiety. The once bright promise of independence dimmed under the strain of David's increasingly invasive behavior. He wrestled with self-blame, wondering if he had failed to recognize danger earlier, questioning whether his desire to help had led him into vulnerability. The office environment itself became tense. Benjamin noticed David's controlled glances, lingering presence, and carefully calculated comments. The subtle cues created an invisible weight pressing on him, sapping energy and confidence. Each day felt longer, heavier, and more taxing. Benjamin's excitement about contributing to a meaningful role in Hawaii shifted into cautious vigilance, a constant effort to navigate potential threats while maintaining professionalism. Thomas observed these changes with growing urgency. He tracked Benjamin's demeanor, noting fatigue, hesitation, and increased anxiety. He recognized the signs of emotional strain that could impact both Benjamin's well-being and their collective stability. Thomas's mind raced through potential strategies, monitoring interactions, providing subtle guidance, documenting incidents, and seeking ways to reduce exposure. Every decision carried the weight of potential consequences, both immediate and long-term. Katherine's role as a silent sentinel became critical. She observed Benjamin's behavior, noting patterns, and identifying triggers that escalated stress. Her mind cataloged every subtle interaction with David, analyzing tone, timing, and context. She began forming a quiet plan to mitigate the harassment without alerting David to their awareness. Katherine's internal dialogue was a constant assessment of risk and protective strategy, balancing support for Benjamin with caution to avoid provoking escalation. As weeks passed, the harassment intensified. David's comments became more pointed, his control more apparent, and the subtle pressure less dismissible. Benjamin endured with quiet resilience, yet the emotional toll was evident. He felt a growing sense of isolation, a creeping fear that his choices were constrained by unseen forces, that every action could be interpreted or manipulated. The balance of their Hawaiian life felt increasingly precarious. The trio's awareness of Charles Donovan's reach crystallized. They understood that even in Hawaii, distant from Florida, the influence of power and manipulation persisted. Charles's network and connections, coupled with David's involvement, created a subtle yet effective system of control. Freedom, they realized, was not merely physical distance. It required strategic awareness, protective action, and eventual decisive steps to reclaim autonomy. Benjamin's inner turmoil reached a peak. He struggled to reconcile the desire to persevere with the emotional cost of harassment. He questioned his capacity to endure, the sustainability of their current life, and the wisdom of remaining entangled in a web subtly designed by powerful figures. Anxiety, doubt, and responsibility intertwined, creating an emotional landscape fraught with tension. Thomas and Katherine provided the stabilizing influence. Their careful attention, planning, and quiet intervention allowed Benjamin to maintain functionality while minimizing immediate risk. Together, they formed a protective network within the apartment, outside the workplace, and in private reflections. This vigilance, however, was not without strain. Each day carried the weight of anticipation, monitoring, and potential escalation. In quiet moments, Benjamin reflected on the paradox of freedom in Hawaii. The sun, ocean, and tropical surroundings offered beauty and peace, yet beneath the surface, invisible pressures eroded the sense of security. He understood that escape from Florida was incomplete. Power, influence, and past connections could follow across oceans. His hope for a new beginning was tempered by the reality of persistent control and manipulation. Katherine's thoughts returned repeatedly to Vietnam. The idea of returning home gained clarity, growing from a vague consideration into a tangible possibility. Vietnam represented distance from Charles, from David, from the subtle entanglements of past influence. It offered a space where they could rebuild without unseen pressures, where their fragile life could take root without interference. The notion became a quiet, persistent anchor in her mind. Thomas considered the logistics, risks, and timing. He weighed the implications of leaving Hawaii, the feasibility of moving to Vietnam, and the potential for reclaiming autonomy. Every detail mattered: finances, travel, timing, and communication. He recognized that leaving was not merely a physical act. It was a strategic move to protect Benjamin and Katherine from ongoing harassment and control. As the month drew to a close, the situation crystallized. Benjamin's initial enthusiasm and optimism were tempered by months of subtle harassment and emotional strain. Thomas and Katherine's vigilance ensured survival, but it became clear that continued exposure in Hawaii carried ongoing risks. The trio understood that a decisive step was necessary, a move to a space beyond the reach of Charles's influence, beyond David's manipulations, and toward genuine freedom and stability. The chapter closed with tension unresolved, but with a path emerging. The experience in Hawaii illuminated the limits of escape without strategy and highlighted the importance of foresight, unity, and protective action. Benjamin, Thomas, and Katherine were poised at a threshold, aware that their next steps would define not just the success of their new life, but the restoration of autonomy, safety, and emotional equilibrium. Chapter 12: The Vietnam Escape. Freedom sometimes requires courage beyond what the heart believes possible. Benjamin, Thomas, and Katherine learned that paradise could trap as easily as it could soothe, and the only escape was home. The decision had not been easy. Weeks of subtle harassment, lingering pressures, and constant vigilance had worn them down, yet strengthened their resolve. Hawaii, once a vision of freedom, had revealed its fragility. No amount of sun, ocean, or tropical warmth could shield them from invisible threads reaching from Florida, threads tied to Charles Donovan and mediated by David Nakamura. They realized that safety was not merely physical, it was strategic. Returning to Vietnam, their homeland, became not just an option but a necessity. Benjamin sat quietly, staring at the blue waves beyond the balcony. His heart carried a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Leaving Hawaii meant uprooting their fragile life, yet it also promised liberation from the unseen pressures that had haunted them. He reflected on the past months, the subtle invasions, the quiet manipulation, the moments of joy overshadowed by tension. Freedom, he now understood, required decisive action. Thomas methodically planned the transition. His architectural mind approached the logistics like a project, balancing feasibility with opportunity. Flights were booked, accommodations prearranged, and contingencies considered. Every detail mattered: the timing of departure, transportation, local contacts, and financial stability. He knew that this move was not just about physical relocation, it was about reclaiming control, autonomy, and peace of mind. Katherine, ever perceptive, coordinated practicalities while managing morale. She ensured Benjamin's optimism remained intact, reminding him of the potential joys ahead, while also reinforcing the reality of preparation and caution. Her role had evolved from a quiet supporter to a strategic guardian. She thought of her brother Thomas and Benjamin simultaneously, understanding that each step they took was not only a journey, but a safeguard against interference from a past that still lingered across oceans. The flight itself was a mix of relief and tension. Benjamin gazed out the window as the Pacific stretched below, feeling the symbolic weight of distance from Hawaii, from David, and from the lingering influence of Charles Donovan. He imagined a new life awaiting them, a space untainted by manipulation, where their decisions, actions, and happiness were their own. The anticipation was thrilling, yet he felt the natural nervousness of leaving behind the familiar. Upon landing in Vietnam, the senses were immediately enveloped by the homeland's vibrant life. The sense of the markets, the sounds of local streets, and the familiar warmth of Southeast Asian sun created a sensory embrace that felt like both welcome and promise. Benjamin's heart lifted, sensing the potential for stability, growth, and genuine happiness. He understood that this was a pivotal moment, a turning point in their lives where freedom could finally become tangible. Thomas quickly set about implementing his plan. Drawing on his architectural expertise, he located a small property suitable for a homestay. The building was modest, yet full of potential. Thomas envisioned the space as a haven, comfortable for guests, functional for daily operations, and aesthetically reflective of his design sensibilities. Each modification, each small decision, represented both a creative outlet and a step towards self-sufficiency. Benjamin found his role naturally emerging. His warmth, charisma, and approachable nature made him a natural face for the homestay. He engaged with guests, shared stories, and created an inviting atmosphere. Every smile, every interaction, reinforced the sense of belonging and purpose. For Benjamin, this role was more than work. It was an affirmation of his autonomy, a way to contribute meaningfully to their shared life. Katherine assumed the role of manager, or as she affectionately considered herself, Mama Tong Quan. She coordinated daily operations, handled bookings, and maintained the smooth functioning of the homestay. Her organizational skills and perceptive attention to detail ensured that operations ran efficiently, guests were satisfied, and both Thomas and Benjamin could focus on their respective roles. Katherine's position reflected both her strategic mind and her protective instincts, ensuring that their new life remained safe and orderly. Life in the homestay was not without challenges. Financial pressures, local regulations, and operational learning curves demanded focus, patience, and resilience. Yet the trio approached each obstacle with optimism, humor, and mutual support. They had learned to rely on one another, balancing strengths and compensating for weaknesses. The sense of agency and independence grew with each successfully navigated challenge. The days unfolded with a rhythm both gentle and fulfilling. Benjamin greeted guests with a cheerful smile, Thomas oversaw renovations and improvements, and Katherine orchestrated operations seamlessly. Together, they cultivated an environment of warmth, friendliness, and professionalism. Their lives were no longer dictated by distant powers. They were authors of their own destiny. Online presence became a tool for growth and visibility. Benjamin, adept with social media, shared glimpses of their homestay, the charm of the local architecture, the welcoming atmosphere, and the smiles of happy guests. Photographs, carefully curated and authentic, attracted attention beyond their immediate locale. Social media posts began to circulate, highlighting the homestay as a hidden gem in central Vietnam. Each like, comment, and share was a small affirmation of their new life, reinforcing both purpose and pride. In quiet evenings, they reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Benjamin thought of Hawaii, of the subtle harassment, and of the emotional strain that had underscored every step. He recognized that freedom had required courage, resilience, and careful planning. Thomas considered the strategic choices, the risks mitigated, and the successful reclamation of control. Katherine reflected on her dual roles as guardian and operator, recognizing the importance of vigilance combined with adaptability. The homestay itself became a symbol of liberation. Guests' laughter, the warmth of shared experiences, and the tangible results of their collaborative effort created a sense of fulfillment that transcended mere financial stability. Each day offered not just work, but joy, purpose, and affirmation. The struggles of the past months seemed distant, contained within memories that now served as lessons rather than burdens. Unbeknownst to them, Charles Donovan, back in Florida, stumbled across online images of their life. He saw Benjamin smiling, Thomas overseeing renovations, and Katherine coordinating activities. The sight struck him with a mixture of disbelief and helplessness. He realized the distance, both physical and emotional, that now separated him from those he had once tried to control. For the first time, the limits of influence became starkly apparent. The power he had wielded in Miami, the subtle manipulations, and the distant oversight, all proved insufficient to reach them here. Charles confronted a quiet, undeniable truth. Some bonds could not be reclaimed through power or authority. The chapter closed with a warm, enduring image. The homestay glowed in the late afternoon sun. Guests laughed in the courtyard, the sound mingling with distant birdsong and the gentle hum of life. Benjamin waved to a group of children exploring the garden. Thomas surveyed the building with satisfaction, and Katherine moved among the guests with quiet efficiency and a smile of contentment. Their laughter, effort, and togetherness created a scene of genuine happiness. Freedom, at last, was tangible. They had reclaimed control, rebuilt a life, and discovered that even after manipulation, harassment, and subtle pressure, joy and stability were possible. The past remained a lesson, the present a reward, and the future a canvas yet to be filled with possibility.